I work at the front desk of the hospital, right by the entrance. I'm working one day at about 4 p.m. when I hear a ruckus coming from the ER. So, I went over to check it out. A heavy-set man in probably his mid-20s is stomping out of the department, with a nurse on his heels. They make it out to the lobby, and the nurse tells him that he needs to leave. I'm standing just behind the nurse, in case she needs help. And sure enough, the guy walks up and pushes the nurse backwards. I intervene and he pushes me too. Another coworker comes over and gets pushed as well. So, we call the overhead code for a violent or disruptive situation, which calls all the available hospital staff to the location of the incident. The guy sits in a chair in the lobby for a minute and just begins screaming out of his mind as the hospital staff start filling the lobby. He walks out the sliding doors, slapping it on his way out and knocking it off the hinge. So, I walked up and pushed it back into place, while my coworkers warned me not to go after the guy, something I had no intention of doing. So, we're all standing in the lobby at this point in kind of a half circle, watching out of the glass of the front windows as the guy paces back and forth, kicking trash cans and stuff. He then proceeds to walk back in, walks past me, and, for whatever conceivable reason, decides to turn around and just punches me straight in the jaw. I recovered quickly, surprisingly not in any real pain, and I see the 6-foot IT guy push the guy down to the ground, and he yells for him to stay down. But surprise, surprise, the crazy punch-happy man decides that he wants round 2. Just as he's trying to get back up, I walk over and put my hand on his chest and gently push him back on the ground, pinning him to the floor so that he can't harm any of my coworkers. The IT guy and a handful of other coworkers and I hold him on the floor until the police arrive a couple minutes later. The funny thing about all this was, I wasn't really even mad or afraid, mostly just amused. As I was sitting there with him pinned to the ground, I looked at him and I said, "Why did you punch me in the face?" He was far too rage-filled at this point to give me any sort of response. The police carried him away, and that was the end of that. This happened about 7.5 years ago, when I was 13. My grandmother was in the hospital with pneumonia. By the time my family got there, there was about 11 to 15 of us. After a little while, they told us that we needed to leave so they could give her some shots. At the time, we didn't know there was another waiting room on the floor, so my uncle suggested we go down to the first floor so we could sit in the ER waiting room. We had to go down on 2 separate elevators since there was so many of us. Once we got down there, we saw 2 nurses hiding behind a door. When we asked what was wrong, they said nothing and that we could still go in there. We walked in and it was about 2 p.m. on a Sunday. There was no one else in there and the lights were off. Yes, in retrospect, we should have just turned around and walked back out, but like all white people in horror movies, we didn't think anything of it. We met up with the rest of the family, and that's when we noticed 2 other guys. The first man was sitting with his hands behind his back. The second one was standing behind him, holding his wrists together. The man sitting was staring daggers directly at me. After about 10 minutes of sitting and staring, a third man in the hospital security uniform comes up and asked if we saw anything. Visibly confused, we said no, and they told us that we needed to leave. We went back up to the 4th floor and found the waiting room there. It was right next to a psych ward with a sign that said, "Stay clear. There's a high chance of flight risks." Now, you may be thinking, what was so scary about that story? A random guy was staring at a 13-year-old girl. Nothing too special. Well, a little while later we found out what actually happened. The man sitting with his hands restrained was a junkie looking for a quick fix. He had walked in and was told that he couldn't get any drugs without a medical reason. So, he pulled out a knife and stabbed the woman at the reception in the neck. Why we were allowed in the room with this man at all while the hospital was still on lockdown, I have no clue. I also have no clue where the police were during this whole situation. This story does have a kind of happy ending for the woman, at least. About 2 years ago, this incident was brought up at a family gathering. My cousin said that the woman did survive, and she no longer works at the hospital and has a lot of difficulties resulting from her injury, but she was working as a secretary for a school he knew. So, psycho junkie who stabbed the reception lady and stared daggers at me? Let's not meet. This story spans over several nights. I'm currently an inpatient at a pediatric hospital to receive IV antibiotics for a cystic fibrosis exacerbation. I'm 17, female, and a freshman in college. My service dog, a 70-pound black golden doodle, is staying with me. Before I go to bed each night, around 12:30, I take him outside to use the bathroom and sniff around a bit. The area that I take him to is off the side of the hospital, with a small patch of grass and a tobacco-free seating area. It's mildly lit and typically empty. You have to walk down a ramp and across the side of the hospital to reach it. I'm on 24/7 medication and fluids, so I'm always attached to an IV pole no matter where I go. When I leave the floor, I'm required to wear a bright green pass that has my room number on it. Tuesday night, my friend was with me and I gave Hamilton, my service dog, his little bathroom and sniff break. A man in a bomber jacket and blue jeans was sitting in the area, smoking. He seemed to be watching us intently, but I was with both my large dog and my friend, so I didn't have anything to be concerned about. The Wednesday night after that, I went out a little bit earlier and didn't see him. Last night, however, he was there again. As soon as I arrived to the area, he made a phone call in a hushed tone, and minutes later, another man showed up. They sat together and were both watching me intently for a few moments, until a young woman walked across the area. I was getting relatively nervous, so I used that as my chance to leave. Both men stood up as I started to leave and followed me up the ramp. At the top of the ramp, a security car was parked nearby and a couple of security guards were standing there talking. I'm assuming the men were either turned around or went into the parking garage at that point, because I didn't see either of them follow me into the hospital. Tonight I went out again, later than usual. The man wasn't at the bottom of the ramp in the area that I go to, so I thought it was clear. I let Hamilton have his bathroom and sniff break before walking back up the ramp. As soon as I stepped off, I heard somebody 15 feet behind me, just about. It was the same man in the bomber jacket coming from the parking garage. He was carrying something small and narrow. I believe it could have been a knife. Nobody was in the vicinity, so I sped up. Every time I looked back, he immediately made eye contact with me. If I sped up, so did he. At one point, my IV pole got stuck on a part of the sidewalk, so I had to stop and lift it. The man picked up his pace, almost jogging now. My dog heard this and turned around. I'm sure that Hamilton picked up on my nerves, and he assumed a big, intimidating stance that I assume was to scare the guy off. He didn't growl, bark, or do anything of the sort because service dogs can't act aggressively. But he stood there and stared intensely at the man while I lifted my IV pole. The man ducked behind a pillar for 10 seconds as I told my dog to leave it, and we made our way as quickly as we could to the hospital doors. However, I didn't want the man to follow me to my room, so I stopped right outside the doors to the actual hospital. From where I was standing, I was directly in the path of visibility for the information desk in a well-lit area. I figured this would be my best shot. The man stopped behind me and waited for about a minute. The girl working at the information desk looked up at us, and the man turned around and walked into the hospital. He walked past me, maintaining eye contact through the glass as he passed. I finally entered the hospital, and he was walking very slowly down the hallway, constantly turning back to look at me, stopping every few steps. Luckily, the lobby was relatively busy, and the pediatric unit that I'm on is locked. I was able to get into the elevator and shut the door before he could get in the elevator with me. I spoke to my nurse, and I'm going to change the time and location that I go outside. However, he may know my room number because I'm required to wear the pass that I mentioned before. And now I'm very nervous that he'll somehow sneak into my unit